Today Matter.
Thank you very much, Aid and Thula, for the invitation. I learned quite a lot from this colloquium. My paper, as Ed said, talks about the Rhodesia tobacco industry, and it's coming from my PhD thesis, which I'm in the process of winding up right now. The thesis looks at the tobacco industry from 1947 to 1979, and I'm looking at the global, regional, and local relations in the development of the industry following the post-war dollar shortages. Actually, this presentation is a bit different it comes from one of the chapters of the thesis, but it's somehow different, because the point that I'm trying to make in that thesis is that when you look at the history of settler agriculture in Rhodesia, the literature that is available seems to be concentrating on internal dynamics. So it looks at the role of the state in the development of settler commercial agriculture. It also celebrates the hard work and astuteness of white farmers in the development of settler agriculture. But such literature tends to underplay the role of the global framework within which either the state or the white farmers were operating in. So, but unlike the major argument in the thesis, when you get to UDI, because UDI attracted a lot of international interest, what you have normally is work that looks at the international without looking at how that international affected the local. So it is in that context that my presentation looks at the tobacco industry. Peter Armstrong has written a book on one of the key actors in sanctions busting, H.W. Freeman, or who was called Ginger Freeman. There's a book called Ginger Freeman, Tobacco Spiced with Ginger, which talks about the heroics of the people who were involved in sanctions busting. So I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at how the sanctions affected local relations. So on 11 November 1965, Ian Smith, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, unilaterally declared the colony's independence from Britain. With the exception of Portugal and South Africa, the international community, under the United Nations and led by Britain, imposed sanctions on Rhodesia in an attempt to halt the rebellion. Tobacco, a predominantly export commodity whose major destination was Britain, became the most vulnerable target of these punitive measures. Sorry. Okay. So, tobacco became one of the targets of these punitive measures. As the industry was the colony's largest foreign currency earner and the biggest employer of labor, it was natural that any measures meant to disrupt the Rhodesian economy were to be directed at it. Against this background, I examined the attitude of the tobacco industry in the build-up to UDI and how the industry readjusted in line with the new dispensation of sanctions after 1965. I also focus on the dynamics of the industry in the face of intensified nationalist guerrilla war in the 1970s until the demise of minority rule in 1979. While at the national level, the rebellious colony was engaging in diplomatic initiatives with Britain and the international community at large, I also argue that at the local level, there were also intense diplomatic and quasi-diplomatic maneuvers within the various economic interest groups. And to a great extent, these have largely not been systematically accounted for in the literature, yet they were vitally important in shaping the direction and pace of events in Rhodesia after UDI. Using the case of the tobacco sector, I analyzed the measures that the tobacco growing industry embraced to navigate and negotiate its survival beyond the demise of white minority rule. And in doing so, I seek to deepen our understanding of the different dimensions of settler colonial politics in Rhodesia and beyond. So, together with other non-state actors and business groups with diverse interests, organized tobacco interests within the Rhodesia Tobacco Association did not support UDI. And maybe I must mention that the tobacco that I'm talking about is Virginia tobacco, or flue-cured Virginia tobacco, which was produced by white farmers only. And it was the dominant crop in Rhodesia. And its market, more than 50% of the crop was going to Britain. Certain portions were also going to West Germany, Japan, and Europe, and the rest of Europe. But Britain was the major market. And those who were producing it were purely white settler farmers. So, together, as I said, the Rhodesian tobacco interests in the Rhodesia Tobacco Association did not support UDI. Were totally opposed to UDI together with other business groups. They were against. They actually wrote a memo to all their members on 22 January 1965, which memo concluded that the economic effects of UDI would be disastrous to the prosperity and prospects of the people of Southern Rhodesia. This, the Rhodesia Tobacco Association reasoned, was because all financial and trade relations between Britain and Southern Rhodesia would be jeopardized. And then the withdrawal of imperial preference would also open Rhodesian tobacco to American competition on equal terms. Yet, with huge government subsidies, American tobacco growers already had a competitive advantage over their Rhodesian counterparts. In addition, with other Commonwealth producers such as Zambia, Canada, and India continuing to enjoy the preference, Rhodesian tobacco would sell at a disadvantage. And the likely imposition of embargoes by Britain, on the other hand, would substantially harm the industry, according to the Rhodesia Tobacco Association executives. However, the sentiments and attitude of the RTA executive towards UDI were not shared across the tobacco growing community. You would find that not everybody supported not everybody opposed UDI. In the membership of the ordinary growers, some of them were so drunk with this UDI, independence euphoria, and they actually opposed their executive, which was pushing for a shift from UDI. So you would see that even some RTA councillors disliked this idea, where it appeared that they were proving the vulnerability of tobacco, and the argument was that doing so was pulling the chestnuts off the fire for Mr. Wilson and providing him with the stick with which he could beat us. I'm just quoting. They were trying to argue that if we oppose UDI by showing that tobacco would suffer, we are actually giving Mr. Wilson in his negotiations with Smith an edge by showing our vulnerability. So, and they even went on to say the Minister of Agriculture, for instance, when this report came out, the memorandum that I talked about, heavily criticized the RTA executive for pointing out the vulnerability of the industry. And he argued that at this stage in the country's history, attempting to raise bogeymen was a disservice to Rhodesia. The report appeared to be another maneuver designed to create unease among the people, especially the farming community. And given this backlash against any resistance to UDI, the Rhodesia Tobacco Association's objections were rather muted and were not enough to shake the regime's determination to cut ties with Britain. And as it were, the moment of madness was not long in coming, and on 11 November 1965, Smith unilaterally declared Rhodesian independence from Britain. And then I move on to look at what this meant for the industry. Predictably, Britain's immediate response was to impose sanctions. And the tobacco embargo was one of the key punitive measures immediately imposed before the United Nations expanded them to be more comprehensive, as Professor Mlambo demonstrated in his presentation earlier. And as I highlighted earlier, literature on Rhodesia's UDI is voluminous. We have heard a lot of stories about what was happening. However, a few specifically focus on the tobacco industry. I refer to the story of Ginger Freeman, which reveals the heroics of those who were charged with the task of sanctions busting. On the other hand, I also refer to the work of David Ross, who also writes a chapter on tobacco, which he titles Muzzled Dogs Don't Bark. And whereas Peter Armstrong focuses on sanctions busting activities in the foreign markets, Raw looks at the state and how it manipulated international markets to capture the tobacco industry and muzzle its players. And I argue that missing in both accounts, because of their scopes, is how under siege from sanctions player in the industry negotiated survival at the local level. The imposition of sanctions on Rhodesia, firstly by Britain and later by the UN, resulted in a major shift in the structure of the colony's tobacco industry. It redefined the relationship between the state, the tobacco growing industry, and markets. In a clear departure from the traditional system of free and unfettered auctions, a new entity, the Tobacco Corporation, was formed to handle the production and marketing of tobacco. Since 1936, the Rhodesian tobacco was sold on open auctions. And that was one of the reasons which made it very popular. But where buyers could compete on the open market. But with the coming in of sanctions, in 1966, government formed what it called the Tobacco Corporation, which then was charged with the role of coordinating production and marketing of tobacco. And the open auction system was done away with, and the tobacco was now being sold in what they called the silent auctions, which were secretive to try and protect the identity of sanction busters. One of the major effects of the sanctions induced the reorganization of the colony's tobacco industry was the erosion of grower power through state control of the production and marketing aspects of the industry. Unlike in previous years, when tobacco farmers could force government to abandon unpopular policies, during UDI, the growers' teeth were blunted by the diminution of their financial masses through narrow profit margins. Tobacco growers could no longer represent the financial and organized heart of right-wing feeling in the country and of the Rhodesian front. Neither were they in a position to pose any real threat to the new trends within the party. This is what the Property and Finance newspaper was reporting during the time. And I argue that this is the context within which David Rowe describes them as muzzled dogs which could not bark. But however, This overstatement of their declining political power masks the extent of influence that they still wielded within the corridors of power. And this can be better understood by tracing initiatives that the local tobacco growing industry embraced to safeguard its self-interest under the constraints of sanctions. And the colony's tobacco industry players, I argue, diplomatically employed tact and subtlety within the limits of their power in pursuit of their organizational interests. And diplomacy, which is the art and practice of conducting negotiations between parties, is influenced by the amount of power that each party wields in relation to the other. And in view of this, one way of understanding the nature of the relationship between the state and the tobacco growing industry, beyond what is suggested by Roe, is through evaluating the relative power that the tobacco growing industry wielded, which determined the extent to which it was able to achieve its organizational goals of entrenching its self-interest. And the amount of power that the tobacco industry had in relation to the state was dependent on the industry's place in the colony's national interest priority list. As I said during the introductory stage, tobacco was a key industry. In 1964, before UDI, it actually constituted 1/3 of the foreign currency earnings of the country. And it also accounted for 40% of the labor, agricultural labor. And so it was a huge industry. But the situation changes after UDI. And the Rhodesian government was well aware of the need to carry out an objective audit of the place of the tobacco industry in the colony, the socio-economic and political arena, to determine its new tobacco policy under UDI. And the government commissioned a technocratic working party to do those considerations, looking at the role of tobacco. And that, even after UDI, the working party concluded that tobacco still remained a very key industry. And the government was obliged to make sure that it supported it, even under difficult circumstances, because it doing otherwise was considered detrimental. For instance, a complete abandonment of tobacco growing would trigger, it was argued, unacceptable costs. For instance, the government would require funds for producer price support in other products, compensation for losses, expanded credit and financial assistance, restructuring costs, increased capital imports for diversified production. For example, you would need man to buy cotton jeans, transport and storage facilities, as well as costly attempts at unfamiliar production with inadequate experience. So these are the working party's findings about tobacco. The infrastructure for tobacco is already there. If you shift into other things, other crops, you are likely to be required to finance all of these. Secondly, being a labor-intensive industry, tobacco employed a large number of Africans. I've talked about that. And then, in addition to economic considerations highlighted, the local tobacco growing industry also derived its power from strategic and security considerations, which influenced the attitude of government. Both government and the industry were cognizant of the general strategic significance of farmers in the area of national security. Contributing to debate on an amendment to the Agricultural Assistance Act, a member of Parliament, Lazo, made this point very clear, and I quote, "In addition to fighting an economic war in the vanguard, the farmers have an additional fight which they are waging. The basis of that fight is their occupants of their farms. And in addition, through their service in the police reserve, they were an essential part of the Rhodesian defense. This," Lazo continued, and I quote, "should certainly predispose government to preserve all the existing farmers on their farms." So I'm trying to highlight the factors that government considered in its relation with the tobacco industry, and they considered the economic impact, they considered the strategic importance of farmers. And remember, the tobacco farmers, if you look at the map, they actually were in the northeastern parts, which were vulnerable to incursions. So there was need really to keep them on the farm for strategic reasons. Deriving strength from the economic and strategic significance that they wielded, the tobacco growers took the state head on in negotiating the protection of their interests. Contrary to the view that they were muzzled or toothless bulldogs in their relations with the state, tobacco growers often won concessions from government. And a case in point was their response to government's producer price. In 1968, there was a fight over government producer price, because with the tobacco corporation, it was now government buying the tobacco. And because the market was difficult to get, despite sanction busting activities and that Professor Mlambo talked about, the market was still very difficult to get. So there were stockpiles of tobacco and Belvedere in Harare, because the state, in order to keep the farmers on the land, had to buy. But because it could not dispose, it had to stockpile. So there was always a fight over the producer price. And the example that I give in 1968, when farmers actually forced government to reopen cabinet debate, which had been closed over price. They'd come up with a price and said, this is what we can sustain. But farmers fought vigorously they protested vigorously, leading to government reopening that debate and actually conceding that the producer price that they'd come up with was not enough. So, and I rush to look at how farmers tried to adapt to survive sanctions and war, especially in the 1970s. And I rely on statements by two different individuals in different circumstances, which help in understanding what was at stake for the Rhodesian farmer in general and the tobacco grower in particular. The first statement was made by Roy Walensky. We have heard about him. In explaining farmers' attitude in the build-up to UDI, he suggested that Rhodesian farmers' determination to fight on emanated from the fact their economic fate was tied to their farms, which was all they had in the world in terms of investment. And the second statement that I use comes from Henry Keane, who was a tobacco grower, who during a meeting of his district's Farmers Association also said that the farmers were tied to their farms, hence, and I quote, "We must fight for a living there. And if it is the government, we must fight for that living." He goes on to say, "We would be sorry, but we would do that." Such were the lengths to which Rhodesian farmers were prepared to go in pursuit of their self-interest. They were even prepared to fight their own government. And what follows tries to look at that. The general impact of sanctions on the Rhodesian economy has received significant scholarly attention. There is Kurewa, who talks about how sanctions added to war bore on the Rhodesian economy. There's also Fimister and Gwande. There's also Dr. Nyamunda there, who also talked about the impact of sanctions on the financial impact of sanctions. So I try to look at the impact of sanctions on the tobacco industry. If you look at the industry from 1947, which is where I start my thesis, you will realize that the industry grew rapidly in the post-Second World War, starting with, in 1947, with about slightly over 1,000 farmers. But by 1964, that number had grown to 3,500 farmers. But when we go to the 1970s, that number was halved to about slightly over 1,500. And this was because of the impact of sanctions. The fall in the number of growers in the 70s can be explained by the intensification of war in the northeastern parts of the country, which were largely tobacco areas, as I said. Reports of abandoned or vacant farms were prevalent during this period. And as I show in my forthcoming thesis, farmers and their workers were subjected to massive intimidation and sabotage. I came across quite a number of files on how farmers' crops were burnt, how even compounds, labor compounds were burnt, and so on. And if you also analyze the roll of honor, which is a list of war casualties carried in the Farmer magazine, it shows that the casualties were concentrated in such areas as Karoi, Doma, Aisha, Headlands, and Shamfa, among others. Those areas were tobacco areas. So faced with this problem, tobacco growers had to devise survival strategies. And I refer to a statement which is made by their president, the Rhodesia Tobacco Association President George Pye, in 1975 during a congress. And he says, I quote, "References have been made to the conservatism and unbending nature of the Rhodesian farm. I believe that the Rhodesian farmer is more flexible, more pragmatic, more prepared to accept needed change than he is given credit for, provided his long-term future is permanently secured. If this cannot be secured, you will be unbending and you will defend what is his by right and by usage, even more vigorously than he has been doing so up to now." I'm just trying to show the level of flexibility that is beginning to creep up in the 70s. Okay, 2 minutes. All right. The underlying question confronting the industry, Pew argues, was how to ensure that its long-term future was permanently secured. Given the apparent failure of the military option to solve Rhodesia's political and therefore economic problems, it is important to examine other measures that the colonies tobacco growers adopted to achieve their goal. And here, because of time, I just rushed to show the shift in farmers' ideological orientation. As I've said, Virginia tobacco was being produced only by white farmers. And in the 1950s, they were very clear that no African should be allowed to produce Virginia. But if you look at what happens in the late 70s, things have changed. They are even supporting African farmers to venture into this area as a way of trying to accommodate a new strategy of trying to accommodate and perhaps prolong their stay on the land. And there are quite a number of other initiatives that they bring. They emphasize they are being African more. We are Africans of we are third generation Africans. The emphasis is that the industry is good for the people. This is an industry for the people and everything. Actually, towards the late 70s, they are pushing for diplomatically to try and endear themselves to the nationalist movement. They've realized that a majority rule was inevitable, and they began to move around, including going to Kaunda, visiting Kaunda. The Rhodesia National Farmers Union Vice Chairman and the Rhodesia Tobacco Association President visit Kaunda to try and negotiate with him and even tell him that they were prepared to accept black majority rule for as long as their industry is protected. So this is what happens in the 70s. In the interest of time, I will stop here, and if there is any questions, I will entertain.